All right. Hello, everyone. We are live. Welcome, everyone, to the channel. I am joined here today by some extremely wonderful people, some special guests to have a discussion on Janny Wurts' To Ride Hell's Chasm. But we are going to begin with a whole lot of non-spoiler discussion for anyone who has not read To Ride Hell's Chasm. So we'll be contextualizing it a little bit within Janny Wurts' broader body of work. We'll be talking about in a non-spoiler way, themes that are present in the book and influences. If you like horses, this is a fantastic book. There are so many cool influences in here to talk about, maybe the magic system. So we're going to have a blast with that. But first, let me introduce my three guests here. We have below me is Johanna from the BookTube channel. Johanna, you want to say hello?
Hello. Thank you so much for having me, Philip. I'm so excited to discuss this book and to meet Janny Wurts. I was really sad that I actually just barely missed out on the chance to meet you, Janny, at the ICFA conference in Orlando. But Philip was
another one. There'll be another year.
Yeah, Philip was with me though when I got your signed edition of your book there.
Yep.
So
yep, I was there in the bookstore. In fact, I think we just almost belatedly realized that there were signed copies and some of these copies weren't signed. So we had to go back and get the signed copy and they were the same price. So it worked out really nice. Yeah. And we also have here Blaise from Under the Radar SFF Books. You may know him from his blog and his podcast. He is always covering some fantastic reads, and it is such a pleasure for me to be in the very first time in a discussion with Blaise. It's so nice to meet you, Blaise, and thank you for being here.
Thanks so much for having me. Always a pleasure to talk about Janny's books. I've been loving them ever since I picked up Curse of the Misrates, but that's for another discussion. So today's all about To Ride Hell's Chasm, and it's best standalone book I've ever read. So we'll get into it.
Awesome. That's a huge endorsement. Best standalone book he's ever read. I've heard that from quite a few people, actually. Also, I want to mention that Blaise has a wonderful interview with Janny Wurts on his podcast about the Wars of Light and Shadow, which is her masterpiece, 11-book series. And so that is it's an interview that I listened to. It is absolutely fantastic. So definitely recommend checking that out. And we also have here Janny Wurts herself coming to us from a remote area with, I'm sure it's a beautiful place, but the internet access isn't fantastic. So she's going to be joining us, just the audio. We're not going to be able to see her, but we're going to hear lots of what she has to say. She is the author of, let me get them all in here, Sorcerer's Legacy, the Cycle of Fire trilogy, the Empire trilogy, along with Raymond Feist, that is. And also she is the sole author of Master of Whitestorm, the author of the 11-book masterpiece Wars of Light and Shadow, as well as numerous short stories and novellas, many of them related to Wars of Light and Shadow, and of course, To Ride Hell's Chasm. And I would add that she is also a fantastic artist, and the covers on her books are all done by Janny Wurts herself. So Janny Wurts, thank you so much for being here. It is such a privilege and an honor to have you here today.
It is a privilege to be with you all. And I think you owe Blaise a big thank you because he was the first of you guys to discover my work. And I'm thrilled. I'm absolutely thrilled with what's been developing. So I'm really happy to be here today. I'm at your disposal.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And indeed, I do thank you, Blaise. You're doing a great job. A trailblazer, I guess we could call you. Sorry, you guys. You have to put up with my horrible puns. But I also heard about your work from AP Canavan. Is one of my best friends here on YouTube, and also just a fantastic person. And he and I and Jimmy from the Fantasy Network are going to be reading The Wars of Light and Shadow. So this was, in a way, just a way for me to get a taste of your writing. And boy, am I so excited now for this. If I wasn't excited before, I was very excited before, but now I'm just completely on edge. just can't wait to get to Wars of Light and Shadow. It's absolutely going to be the biggest thing going on my channel this year. So I'm really excited for that.
It's going to blow my mind watching you discover all the layers to that one, because it's such a slow burn and it unfolds very, very carefully. So watching a new group of people go through it and actually getting to see how they react and knowing what's coming, believe me, I'm going to be enjoying this more than you.
Well,
because I know what's baked in and I know what's coming, and I can go, ooh, got you there. Ooh, got you there.
Yeah.
So it'll be fun.
Oh, it's going to be a blast, an absolute blast. And I know a lot of other people around BookTube are going to be reading it as well. But let's get to what we're here today to do. So I'd like to get to Johanna's and Blaise's non-spoiler assessment of To Ride Hell's Chasm. But before we do that, would you mind, Janny, giving us a kind of a sense of where To Ride Hell's Chasm fits within the broader context of your work, and anything you'd like to say about that would be fantastic.
I sort of have two approaches to writing. One of them is very linear and much simpler. So my earlier work, Sorcerer's Legacy, Master of White Storm, The Cycle of Fire, the Empire series, they all are very linear stories and they're easier reads. They're much easier reads. Okay. Hell's Chasm is kind of the hinge in between, where the style got a little bit more complex. The characters got a little bit more complex. The political dynamics have a little more layering to them, but mostly the style is a transition. So if you read that, it's a good stepping stone across. The people who go from the earlier work or go from Empire in particular, and they say, oh, I love this as a teen, or I'm still a teen, and they try to step into Light and Shadows, they're just not ready to get off the deep end.
Okay.
Stylistically. So that's where it sort of fits. It was designed to be a stepping stone between the two areas of my career.
Wow. Brilliant. All right. So it is a good way then for someone to get a taste, a flavor. It is not in the same universe. It is at all of Wars and Light and Shadow, but would you characterize it as perhaps a good way for someone to get a taste, a flavor of your style in the Wars of Light and Shadow?
It's a good stepping stone across. Yeah. If you know you want a more relaxed read, you're going to be reading on an airplane. You know, you don't want to get as heavily invested with paying attention to every little piece of detail. Try the earlier books. If you're coming across from the Empire and you want that easier style, try the earlier books. If you really like to chew on something that's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger and deeper and make you think and make you reach for it, because it isn't about what's on the lines. It's also, as AP puts it, the way the lines are written, what's occurring between the lines is so implied. So you need a much tighter focus, and you can't skim, because you'll miss out on the cue points that you need to continue. So I think a lot of people stepping across from the Empire, they're not ready for it. They're just not ready for that kind of focus, and it throws them, and then they toss it aside, when really they either had to wait and get older or wait for the right mood, or realize it's a much deeper read, like a Blaise or like some of the other bigger series that take a lot more focus to really understand the nuance.
Brilliant. You're getting, I don't know if you're seeing all these comments in the chat, but you're getting quite a bit of praise here from our people in the chat, over 50 of them. And there's a lot of enthusiasm for To Ride Hell's Chasm here. So that is just wonderful to see, and just want to acknowledge everybody in the chat. Thank you for being here. This is great.
Well, it's music to my ears, because so much went into that book.
Yeah. Well, you're getting some love here in the chat, that's for sure. So let's hear then. I think we can move on to a non-spoiler assessment of the book, and I'd love to hear from Johanna and Blaise, their reactions to Ride Hell's Chasm. If you guys in the chat, you're safe. If you have not read the book, we are sticking with non-spoiler assessment right now, focusing on the themes that are present, trying to characterize it. There's a bit of mystery in here. It begins with, and then the pace really quickens as the plot sort of bifurcates. And it's just really quite a breathtaking read. But there's some really, you talked about nuance before and all the threads. There's some really great themes present here. I want to give Johanna and Blaise a chance to talk about those. And then once they're done with that, perhaps we could hear from you, Janny, about some of your influences that are in this book. Because I remarked about horses before. It was just, I felt like there was so much authenticity in this book in terms of how the characters interact with the horses. I'm conjecturing that you have a lot of medicinal knowledge, or you're really good at faking it, one or the other. But there's just so much to talk about here. But first, maybe we could get Johanna, if you don't mind starting us out. What are your non-spoiler thoughts?
Yeah, sure. I have a lot of thoughts. First, I want to say it's such a pleasure to be here again, but it's kind of funny because I first found out about you, Janny, through AP Canavan as well. I think he tweeted about you, and I thought, who is this author? And the next thing I knew, I just seemed to see you everywhere, and everyone is talking about what an amazing, brilliant author you are. And they were not wrong. But it's kind of funny to me because when I saw your picture on Twitter and saw your posts, I thought, this seems like such a nice person and such a lovely, warm vibe coming from this person. And then I read your book and I'm thinking, she is so mean to her characters. You just don't let anybody get away with getting off the hook. Nobody comes.
Don't worry, my husband will pick it up.
Okay. I was thinking, like, it's not only that nobody gets out unscathed, it's like you almost don't even start unscathed for most of these characters. And so but I absolutely loved this book. I've been telling people that this has been my favorite read of the year so far. And I really am so impressed with the layers of themes that are present throughout. I would say there are probably multiple themes that we'll get into, but especially I think I saw here in the chat, the Drowned Kingdom. I think that's ML, if I'm not mistaken. And he talked about your adroit and sensitive handling of racism and racial injustice. Oh, yeah. And I couldn't agree more. That is a theme that really speaks to my heart whenever I read about it. And I really was impressed with how nuanced and sensitively you handled that theme. And as well as I think we talked a little bit in our chat on Twitter about the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law. And you definitely see that come to play. There are in actually multiple characters, the theme of like how what integrity means, especially when it comes to doing what your role in society dictates you're supposed to do in principle from that regard versus the calls of the heart. And then related to that, I would say mercy. Mercy was a big theme that I saw throughout the book, and mercy in relation to death. And whether death is a mercy and whether we come to know about mercy through knowing about death. And so those were just a few of the themes that I saw as a first-time reader.
Well, you dug into about half of them.
Yeah, beautiful.
Spot on. I'll let Blaise take the other half then.
Blaise, it's your job now to cover the other half.
Yeah.
Well, thank you guys so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Janny, nice to talk to you once again. So to Ride Hell's Chasm, I came into it from the other side. So I first read Janny's War, Light and Shadow series. So I got it. I came into this from the other end, knowing what's coming and then what to expect. And then Janny mentioned that this was written halfway, when she was like halfway done with her War and Light and Shadow series after Peril's Gate. And this was the result of it. So it covers a bunch of themes that I think are very important in our society today. It deals with issues of racism with our two main characters. It deals with issues of law enforcement, how they're trying to do the right thing and solve this mystery of the kidnapped princess, going about that in a different way. It touches on a lot of history, especially our main character, Mikhail, and what he had to go through early on with his family and his childhood, and then eventually coming up to be the guard of Cecily, the Citadel, how he had to overcome a lot of prejudices in the kingdom, but he's such a loyal and prideful person and guard that he will never let you down. No stone will be left unturned to find the answer and to get results. And then on the other side, you have Taskins, who's kind of a balancing act between like the royal people in charge and his loyalty, because he knows who Mikhail is and what he's gone through. It also deals with themes of, horses. Janny, about riding horses better than anyone I know. Like some of the riding scenes in this story are fantastic, and especially ones with medicine as well and healing. So those are just fantastic to read about once again. And yeah, we'll get into all the meaty details coming down the road, but best standalone I've read. You said it's like an epic fantasy combined with like 24, because it's only 5.5 days that this story takes place. So buckle up. It is definitely a wild ride.
Beautifully said. Thank you so much. And we're getting some nice comments in the chat. I would encourage everybody in the chat. And again, we're keeping this non-spoiler right now for anyone who might be there who has not read the books. But if you want to add to our discussion of the themes that are present in To Ride Hell's Chasm, feel free in a non-spoiler way. Jennifer Robin left a great one here, making assumptions about other people and how that can take your life in unexpected directions. Absolutely spot on, I would say. So brilliant stuff. I don't really have anything to add in terms of the themes myself. So let's hear from Janny about some of the important influences. Blaise just mentioned the horses, and I was really blown away. I have to say, I've never read a fantasy that was written by someone who had such thorough knowledge of horses before, and it really shows in the book. It's just fantastic, and the relationship between the people and the horses, it was very touching and had me tearing up in places. It was really quite something. So maybe Janny, if you'd like to talk about some of the influences. Am I right too about the medicinal knowledge? Because you did a really great job with that as well.
Well, you're the only one who's ever talked about it, so we'll get into it. This is the first time it's ever come up, or any reader at all has ever asked.
Okay.
As far as the horses go, the original seed idea for this book was the Tevis Cup, which is a race, which is an endurance race. It takes 24 hours. It takes place in the Southwest. It's a 100-mile ride, 24 hours over a mountain, rugged desert terrain. And of course, the horse that's still sound and crosses the finish line first. And they have vet checks all the way along. But I thought, what if there was a fantasy that had extreme terrain and the horses had to bring the people through? And it's been a bother to me because I've worked and trained horses all my life. I've worked with hounds. I work with a search and rescue, and we have a canine unit. I see these animals put their lives on the line for people all the time, even in shows, even in racing, whatever the horses are asked to do, or the dogs. They do it because they want to. They do it because they love their job, and they do it because they love and trust their handler.
Yeah. And
so often their personalities are secondary concern in all the Westerns, it's just an animal. And they're not like that. They're as individual as you are or I am. And I've ridden hundreds of horses over the course of my riding career. And we thoughtlessly use all of their gifts. And they so seldom get the credit. They so seldom get the credit they deserve. So I said, I'm going to make the horses as central to this book as the heroes are. So that was sort of tier one. Tier two was two characters that are totally different in background. One is the king's right-hand man. He's the captain of the Royal Guard. He's generationally had this position passed down through his family. He's honorable to a fault. He's not so enamored of his position that he can't see the truth, but he's got his hands tied because the law sometimes prevents law enforcement from doing the right thing.
Yeah.
And then you have the warrior on the other side. And I wanted a fish out of water. I wanted somebody who was alienated by the society around him. And that was where all of my work working with people of color who were not backgrounds like I have, and the injustices I have seen them face, and the casual comments that I see them it's so damaging. So it just happened that character stepped into that role. And what do you do when you're the warrior? You're trained to be the one with the sword. You're trained to be the one to kill. Whose choice is it really what you do? When do you follow the orders, and when do you choose not to? Where does your ethic play? Because you're not owned by your superior officers. If you refuse to do the killing blow, you're the ultimate responsibility. And so whose responsibility is it? If somebody gives you a bad order, when do you countermand it? Where does your ethic come into play? Because it's got to be one of the hardest things to be the guy with the gun on the front line of a war, and you're told, shoot this person, and you know it's wrong.
Yeah.
Or shoot this person. If everybody didn't do it and they all laid down their guns, what would happen? So I took that scenario and packed it into 2 characters and sort of did a twist with it. So that, and then figured I'm going to set it in a tiny little country the size of Switzerland, where it's very homogenous. They have a very tight little tradition. They don't see outside their borders too much. So the threat that's facing is bigger than their experience shows. And so all of these things coming into play and twining into a knot. And I guess it's a philosophy of mine, having been lucky enough to be allowed to explore a lot of things on my own. I did an education, a college where they did not make me make grades. I contracted out.
Yeah, that's great.
And then fill the contract out. So you realize you really are in a position of the knowledge you want in this world exists. It's in a book, it's in a museum, or it's in somebody's head. Go get it. So I want to write about characters who don't give in, who see past the limitations they're handed, and hopefully inspire people to realize just because you were told you couldn't do this, or just because somebody said it wouldn't work, doesn't mean you can't reach beyond your borders and do something impossible that you were told was impossible. And it is possible. You just have to decide to open the box and do it.
Yeah.
So there was that aspect of that too, is what do characters do when they're desperate and you have to use your imagination to solve a problem? We're trained from an early age that imagination is for children. And no, it's not. It's our best human ability to solve problems. So I wanted a book about that too. Who could imagine solving the problem and who was blockaded by the fact they didn't believe they could? And that all hitting together. So you have all different ranges of people in this book. Even the fat lady sings. Yeah. Everybody has to play their part. And every secondary character in the book has their moment where if they weren't there, the whole string would come unraveled. And that's like life.
I love the way you achieved that too, through the magic system, by the way, which we'll, I'm sure, get into in the spoiler section.
Well, thank you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Couple things. I also want to point out that this book was published in 2002, I believe. Mm-hmm. And everything you talked about, and some of our viewers in the chat have talked about as well. I mean, what an important thing to be writing about when it comes to assumptions about people and race and things post 9/11.
9/11 happened in the middle of writing this book, just as I wrote that, where this threat is facing these people.
Wow.
And it's like how frail the fabric of society is and what depths, if that fabric tears, what can emerge through the bottom of that tear, because we grow up believing that certain things are given, but certain things can be threatened and taken away. And when those tears happen, you're walking over the abyss. Then you really have to fall back on your ability to solve the problem, to twine the string back together and keep things running. And it's something that at least my generation hasn't had to face enough. And that moment was a big break for a lot of people because they hadn't been out of the country, or they hadn't seen a third world country, or they hadn't traveled enough, or they hadn't talked to people below their class, where class was different than theirs, so that they had to understand another culture. You know, they stayed in their insular world and they never broke out. So how frail is that fabric? And when you have to build a fabric out of all these disparate threads, how do you do that? It can be hard.
Well, and I think it says in your biography, if I'm not mistaken, that you saw the fantasy genre as an opportunity to explore these type of themes and questions and challenges that we have in our real lives. And I was wondering if you mind talking about that too.
There are certain topics that if you wrote them in mainstream literature, you would be targeted, especially today with the dogpiling on social media. You would be torn apart. You would get hate mail. You would even stir up the wrong kind of factions. And, you know, we've had authors have fatwas on them because they wrote about a subject that somebody else considered was against their whatevers. Fantasy enables us to take down those barriers and kind of slip it under the rug and then pop it out where people don't expect it, and hopefully make you think a little bit. make you think differently in a situation than you would have if you hadn't broken the boundaries in a book. So yeah, being able to handle certain topics with the gloves off, and you might not get it right. I'm going to have plenty of critics that say you did this all wrong. But you know what? It counts that you tried.
Yeah.
And the ones who say you did it wrong, well, you listen to them, and then you learn and you see another facet that you were blind to before. So it's all part of the discourse that grows us as human beings.
Yep.
Beautifully said. Yeah.
Fantastic. Blaise, any questions for Janny so far in terms of the themes, or do you want to add anything to anything that was said?
Yeah, just one thing I wanted to touch on. Janny, the way you handle the grueling after effects of war, especially from Mikhail's storyline, because this is not a spoiler. It has pretty much on the first page. He has his leg is hurt from a past event, right? And then you also deal with episodes of PTSD with him, and he has recollections of the horrible events that have transpired, and he's constantly reliving them in his mind, and how that was handled. It was handled with such care. I don't think I've ever read a fantasy book that goes into those effects of war quite in detail. I guess how did you come up with wanting to tell that particular part of the story for Mikhail, and just some more information on that?
In knowing a lot of people who were veterans who came back from Vietnam completely shattered. They can't go to a state park without having a panic attack. They couldn't sit out in my backyard under a palm tree and hear the wind through the foliage in the heat in a Florida summer without having flashbacks. And you were mentioning the medicinal. I've done a lot of alternative medicine and a lot of energy work. And so helping those people work through some of their difficulties gave me a big grasp of they face challenges coming back into society after all this adrenaline and all this horror that they see. And I think that the people in society can have a hard time wrapping their mind around it. I mean, I'm not a first responder, but I do work search and rescue, and I see some pretty raw stuff. I was in the Bahamas after Dorian, everything leveled, and what those people were going through. And there's a cooperation of people when a disaster strikes like that. What was humbling in that experience, being around those people, and we were not searching for a live find, that was long gone. We were helping them identify where the remains were. So when they cleaned up the rubble, they wouldn't wipe away someone's relative and wipe away closure for that family. Everywhere we went, the gratitude that we were there with our cadaver dogs, the gratitude that we came there to help them overwhelmed me, because it's like, we're here to help you, but what they gave us back was 1,000-fold.
Wow.
So
wow.
PTSD is real. I've done some cold case search and rescue where you definitely see what the families are going through. You hear the awful details of how that person was lost. You're trying to solve a cold case that maybe is 30 years old, but to that family, it's yesterday. And if they can get closure, what it's going to mean to them. So you do have flashbacks. You do have extreme moments. I've done a lot of extreme wilderness. I've done a lot of extreme riding. You have to think on your feet, and it affects how your brain works. It definitely affects how you respond to a problem around you. It makes you much more able to jump in and help, whereas everybody else freezes. You're probably going to be the one to step in and handle it. So there was a desire to bring some of that to the page and bring some of that trauma to the reader, so that maybe they'd be a little bit more sensitive to the homeless guy who can't function in society anymore. Because the reflexes were trained all wrong for what they need to live in society now. So it's a hurdle we haven't fully crossed yet, that we haven't learned how to bring these people back in. There are many, many groups working on it, and there's no one solution works for all of them. So trying to bring a little piece of that, what the damage of being the warrior does to the mind. And, we're watching it all unfold, the damage of what's going on in Ukraine right now. That's going to be a whole other generation.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, beautifully said. And there's some profound things in here. Um, by the way, I also want to mention that I went to a college with no grades as well, so I'm definitely with you there. Now, I think you covered the. Do you want to say anything additional about the medicinal influences? I think you covered that pretty well, but if you do, I'll let you go ahead with that. If not, perhaps we could talk about the magic system a bit in a non-spoiler way, because I did find that very interesting. And I don't know if Johanna or Blaise, if you have any specific questions about the magic in the book. If they're spoiler, we'll save them for later. If not, go ahead and chime in. But perhaps we could just characterize that for folks in the chat who have not yet read To Ride Hell's Chasm.
Well, you wanted the medicinal aspect. My first experience with that would have been life-saving class in high school, but really I went to Outward Bound at 17 and a half.
Aha.
And the original Outward Bound program was designed because in World War II, the guys were getting their ships sunk out from under them in the Navy. And the 40-year-olds were surviving and the 20-year-olds were dying. And they were like, this shouldn't be happening. The 20-year-olds should be surviving and the 40-year-olds should die. And they figured out psychologically the younger people had not been tested to the extreme and they didn't understand the elasticity of their limits.
Huh.
So Outward Bound was designed to take every limit you had and stress you so hard that it snapped it and you had to keep functioning beyond that, so that you had a survival instinct, realizing no matter what comes down, you will manage and you can be trustworthy and you can handle what you were just trained to do and not collapse and fall apart. And every person that went through our brigade, which was 12 people, reached a point where they hit a wall where they did not think they could finish whatever it was that was started. For me, it was taking a basket over a 200-foot rappel, where I was responsible to the guy in the basket. I was one of the rappellers holding that basket, and 6 guys on each line were belaying that basket. And if they failed, we would have fallen 200 feet, and the guy in the basket totally helped us. And we went over that cliff, and when that basket swept my feet out from under me, total panic, because I didn't trust them not to screw up. But they couldn't screw up because it was 3 lives on those lines.
Wow.
That was the kind of extreme test. They've watered it down a bit because there were some deaths and there were some accidents. But the original program before they watered it down was very strenuous. So they put us through major first aid treatment. And they did bloody scenarios in the woods where, they would fake a compound fracture, and we had to know how to deal with that. So we'd be going about our business, learning how to navigate whitewater, and we hear this blood-curdling scream in the woods, and we would report there, and there'd be a person with blood all over them with a compound fracture, apparently. So that was pretty extreme training for a 17-year-old. And I have built off that with search and rescue. They give us a lot of emergency management and a lot of extreme training every year, and they renew the training every year. So that's been part of my background. Where I hit the wall was when I was in college. I studied science. I thought for sure I was going to be a scientist. And I studied microbiology and I studied marine biology. And I was on the research team for the astronomy and I was running the telescopes. And I had my hit the wall moment with science was standing there with 3 PhD professors, 1 radio telescope guy and 2 other guys. And I'm running the telescope because I'm the guy finding the things that the people want to find so they can see what they're seeing. And I look up and I go, what's that? Because I see something go by. And the 3 guys standing next to me, PhD scientists, you didn't see that? Yeah, we see it. Well, aren't you curious what that is? No, we can't talk about that because our reputations would be shot.
Oh, no.
This is not scientific, what we're seeing up here. There's no way to prove it. There's no way to test it. There's no way. And I said, aren't you curious? And they're like, no, we can't spare from our hard science physical career to even look at this stuff. And I just went, wow, so many things outside the envelope are falling on the ground, and it's not acceptable to study them. It's not acceptable to talk about them. It's not acceptable to acknowledge they exist. So at that point, I said, I can't be a scientist. I'd have more fun running the telescope than I would doing all the math and putting on blinders saying this and this and this don't exist. So I decided not to build all those barriers, and I decided to see things that people refused to believe were there. And it's led me into all kinds of crooks and corners,
Yeah.
alternative medicine and whatnot. So yeah, I'm hardline trained scientifically first aid. I know how to package a guy up and send him off in the ambulance or get him out of the woods or put him in a basket or, splint this or stop the bleed, whatever. But there's other things that are outside that envelope. And you start talking to other cultures. Like I had the privilege of talking to a 98-year-old Aboriginal senior lawman. They
Wow.
don't think like we do, and they have other ways to solve those kind of problems. Sometimes they're good and sometimes they're not good. And sometimes it's off in the ether compared to what our experience is. But if you drop your boundaries and really look, not everything they're talking about is garbage. In fact, quite a lot of what they're talking about is not garbage at all.
Yeah. In fact, we probably have a lot to learn from them, I would say.
Yeah, I was reading an academic treatise of old Welsh cosmology. And they were dividing the planets up into groups. And here was this academic writing about they did not understand the orbits of the planets. This is totally the wrong order. This is totally wrong. Just dismissing that whole cultural thing. And I looked at it and I said, this isn't a cosmological map of the orbits around the sun and the order in which the planets go around the sun. This is an energetic map. This is an energetic map, and they're dividing it by the 4 quarters. They're dividing it to earth, air, fire, and water, depending. So if you knew your astrological feed in, you looked at this and you go, they're making perfect sense, but they're on a different page of the universe than these scientists that don't know anything else but what they see through a telescope. So a little bit of that is sort of worked into the cracks of Hell's Chasm. I don't recommend that you use it for, your medicine training or anything like that. But I tried to put things in there that said there's more than what we know and a lot more than what we think we know. So dare break the envelope.
Fantastic.
Wow. It's so interesting that you bring that up because while I was reading Hell's Chasm, I loved the magic. And I'll just say, spoiler free, that there's a wonderful range of magic, I would say. There's sorcery, but there's also interesting shamanic magic.
Yeah.
And I won't go into details about that in fear of spoilers, but I loved that, of course, there are consequences to the magic. It's creatively used. It's also not overbearing with like rules and things like that, but there are consequences. It does seem to have a system behind it. But the shamanic magic in particular, when I was reading about that, I was wondering about that because the inspiration behind that, because I was thinking some of it felt kind of familiar to me, like it could have been drawn upon something that is a real practice somewhere in the world.
I don't like culturally appropriating anybody. I've had the privilege to sit down and talk to some pretty amazing people from other cultures that are not mine, and I'm not at liberty to talk about what they told me. But when you listen to that long enough, you realize there's an underlying similarity. There are underlying principles that work with all of them. And so I did not culturally appropriate any of those people's knowledge, but I did take the universal picture that's underneath it. I had an odd experience while I was in college. The astronomy department hired me to go into the mythology behind all of the constellations. They wanted to do a mythology of astronomy class. And I did that probably when I was 20. And it blew my mind because I don't care what culture you came from, whether you were from this little culture in northern hemisphere, Arctic, you were from Africa, you were from Australia. The 7 sisters are always the 7 sisters. Orion is always the hunter. The similarity of what they believed about the constellations, the mythos around them was more similar. And I'm going, how can these disparate cultures at the opposite ends of the earth, at the opposite ends of the polar spectrum, have such a common cosmology behind their mythos? It blew me away. So I said, in a way, there are probably connections that we have to each other that are older than history, but they're still alive. And nobody was more surprised than me to see that. And about the only cosmological thing that did not follow that system where the hunter was always the hunter, the 7 sisters was the Milky Way. That mythology divided radically. each culture thought differently about the Milky Way.
Yeah.
So it made me think that there is a universal template behind some of this stuff. And so if it felt familiar to you, that's great. I hit the target exactly that I was shooting for, which was to hit the common note without culturally appropriating anybody's personal beliefs.
No, that's
Yeah,
perfect.
absolutely.
Blaise, do you have any non-spoiler thoughts or questions on the magic system or anything else that we might have? Your point about PTSD was so good. I'm glad you brought that in. But do you have anything on the magic you want to ask?
Well, getting into the magic, probably get more into the spoiler section, so we can save
True,
that
yeah.
for that. We can save that for the later discussion. Yeah, how the magic system interacts with our with the world and the characters and the main plot. That's definitely heavy spoiler, so I think we'll stay here for that.
Okay, sounds good. So for the good of the order, anything else non-spoiler that anyone wants to raise? Johanna, Blaise, Janny Wurts herself, anything non-spoiler that we should tell people out there who have not yet read To Ride Hell's Chasm?
Well, here's one thing. You won't be able to predict the ending.
That's for sure.
Every single thing that I write, I always build in an insoluble problem, and I don't know how it's solved. I won't know how it's solved till I get to the very edge of that chapter, because if I can see it coming, so can you.
Yeah.
So think about that. You'll know the scene I'm talking about.
Oh, I know exactly what you're talking about, and I
Yep.
did not see it coming. So yeah, that is for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. You do not. There's no way you can predict that. Absolutely. Good point.
And just one thing about Janny and her writing in general, she always sticks her endings, she sticks her landings, and she never writes the same ending twice. So you guys are in for a big treat when you pick up the rest of her works. And this one I was not able to predict. And I actually reread it before we jumped on. So yeah, it was a great ending.
Yeah.
Yeah, I loved that. I loved that resolution because I had no idea how it was going to happen. No idea whatsoever.
Yeah.
So that was brilliant.
That's a good point. I had an idea it would happen and I didn't know how, and I was blown away. Yeah, I just want to say that I, again, am so impressed with this standalone. I highly recommend everyone pick it up for a really strong fantasy standalone. And I know a lot of people, I think a common complaint is just in a lot of fantasy today is heavy exposition, which I don't tend to mind in fantasy. But one thing that Janny does so well in this book that I want to mention is just how she integrates world building and magic and character development in a very seamless way without ever making you feel like you're stopping the story to explain things. It just moves along so beautifully. There's so much. It's so rich in that regard, I would say. And it even kind of starts right. I like the starting point too, which I think we can also talk about. Well, at the starting point, we just know that the princess has disappeared. So I guess I could say that's spoiler free.
Yep.
But I think the way it starts, you're kind of just in the middle of the action. So it kind of has that immediate as kind of beginning. But it's never confusing. I feel like you're always kind of led along and to understand what's happening in a seamless way. So I just think the writing in this is incredible. I'm just completely blown away with what you have achieved in one standalone. It's absolutely incredible. So I just want to say, please pick this up, give it a shot, and you will not be disappointed, I think.
Yeah. And it's on the back cover, Johanna, so you're completely safe saying the princess has disappeared. That's the first thing that you know in the book. So right on the back cover, so it's legit. Non-spoiler point to make.
Well, that was also one of the points. It's like we've all read the book about the princess being forced into a marriage. We've all read the book about this and that and that and that. And then I said, I'm going to just stand this on its head.
Yep.
What if it was the match made in heaven? And what the heck happened? So it's a missing person story from page 1, but it takes a bunch of tropes and flips them upside down. And she's not helpless. She's not damsel. She's herself.
Yeah.
And so it starts as a missing person story. And it is a horse story. So, you know, the horses are not a euphemism. They're real horses. There are horses that I've worked with. Just like that.
Okay.
Amazing.
Yeah, my final non-spoiler thoughts are just going to be to mention that this is a very rich and very layered, nuanced book. So give it some time. Give it some time. A lot of the books that we love, and there's nothing wrong with this, by the way, but a lot of the books we love tend to be action-packed from the beginning, bam, bam, bam. This book delivers an incredible pace at the end. You'll be absolutely knocked off your feet. But it does take a little while, I think, to allow yourself to be immersed in the world and just bathe in the richness of the prose and the world building and the character work. Allow yourself to do that because it has such incredible payoff. So, Blaise,
one of the things that went into the writing of this is the impact of what happens to you is stronger when you slow your mind down. So when you slow down your thought process, the impact of what is happening, you pick more detail up, it becomes more real, it becomes more concrete. So that sucking finish that you get happens because literally the language is designed to immerse you and slow you down. So in my later career books, I always say it's experiential. You are going to come out of this book not just with a read, you're going to have an experience and it will be engraved in your memory. And part of that is the style because it forces you to slow down. And that's not something today's readers like to do because we live at light speed. We're on and off our phones. We're communicating by text. We're used to movies where you can get a visual image just like that. To build that visual image that the movie does takes words. And I grew up reading the library. I did not buy popular paperbacks where the language was simpler. I read hardbacks that were published. And I read hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. So the vocabulary to do this job is there. I didn't have to force it. I have it. So the later books in my career are definitely experiential. And I'm deliberately forcing you not to speed over those details because that is what's going to give you that gut-wrenching feel for what happens later. And you walk away, this book will be engraved. It will be an experience. You'll have some of that PTSD from these books. And that's how it's built. So if it's not your preference to slow down, if you want a fluff read, you want to be able to skim, this is not necessarily a book for you.
Yeah, this is one that sticks with you, folks. Blaise, I'll let you finish up the non-spoiler portion of our discussion with any final thoughts you have. And then just a warning ahead of time, everyone, we will get into spoilers for To Ride Hell's Chasm. So Blaise, any final thoughts?
Yeah, just piggybacking off of what Janny said in terms of how to come into this book. One off, don't have any expectations or think you know what's gonna happen. She'll turn everything on its head. It'll surprise you at every single turn. The writing is rich with prose and it's a little dense, done on purpose. It forces you to pay attention to every single line. And this is why this is a great stepping stone for her later series. It's a similar type of prose and interaction. You want to be engaged with the characters. You want to be engaged with the plot. Every little sentence could completely change your perception of where the plot's going, what the characters have done, what they're going to do, and what their influences are. That's just how Janny writes. And it's a masterclass in writing. I know many writer friends who have picked up Janny and are forever thankful that it's inspired them. I know PL Paul, you're watching as well. Just shout out to you. And it's just
his comment is absolutely confirming what you're saying, Blaise. Yeah.
It's just an experience you're not going to forget. Every single book of Janny's that I've read, it just stays ingrained in your mind for weeks and even months down the road. That's just what you guys are in for. And we'll talk about spoilers, but definitely pick this up if you're on the fence. I highly recommend it. And let's go from here.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much. So this is the official warning. We are now going to be wandering into spoiler territory for To Ride Hell's Chasm. Thank you everyone in the chat who is going to be departing. Thank you for showing up. We hope that we've given you a taste of this book. And I cannot say it better than Blaise just said it. go and check out this writing. It's just tremendous and life-changing. So absolutely beautiful stuff. So there's the warning. Everybody who wanted to leave hopefully has left, and we are now going to get into the spoilers. So, okay, well, I don't know where you guys want to start, but I want to give you a chance to have a couple, maybe if there are questions from people in the chat as well who have read the book, go ahead and throw out your spoiler-filled questions as well. But Johanna and Blaise, if you have something specific you want to start with, the floor is yours.
So one question that's immediately coming to mind, and this might not even be spoiler, I'm not sure, but this will even give people more chances to get off, I guess, the live. But I was wondering too about the title. Obviously, there is a Hell's Chasm, which we visit and we get trapped in. But I just wondered, is there more of like a metaphor or thinking behind that? Because we did talk earlier about jumping hurdles and those kinds of conflicts of choice that arise for these characters. And so I just love the title, and I just wondered if you had some kind of subtext to that. Or
there's always subtext, because we're constantly thrown problems. Everybody who navigates life is thrown problems they don't think they can solve. And we're taught from when we're very young, don't bother trying. Honestly, the experimental imaginative thing is always thrown out or dismissed by the adults who are already ossified. And it's like when they were developing the Apollo program, and von Braun said he hired all young engineers that practically had not finished college because they weren't ossified yet. They were still thinking outside the boundaries. Therefore, they did things that other people wouldn't have thought to do. And I think we dismiss imagination as for children, or, and it's not. It's the most powerful thing we have as human beings, besides our empathy, is to be able to imagine a different solution. So that Hell's Chasm is crossing a gap that you don't think can be crossed. And you see the characters solve every problem that is insoluble. How do you heat hot water when you don't have a bucket? How do you deal with crossing a river when you don't have the equipment to do it? How do you deal with all the things that you have to innovate? And I wish that our educational system gave us those tools and encouraged us to solve problems using imagination, using areas or ways that have not been done before. And so this book is metaphorical, crossing Hell's Chasm. They're literally getting out of the biggest threat that's ever faced them. And they have to innovate their way through it, because no one person has all the answers. And in every case, the individual is equipped to find those answers. So I tend not to write grimdark books, because they like to take everything's going to go to shit, and then you got to go back and kind of philosophize about it. I'm saying everything goes to shit and you can do something about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Father taught me that.
That's the one thing I probably should have said in the spoiler-free section, but that's a reason why I loved this book so much, is that the books that move me the most are not only ones I think that challenge us in those ways, that make us kind of challenge our own mindsets and how we're dealing with problem solving, how we're looking at integrity and principle, and just the conflicts that you brought up. And because these are things that, like you said, that they apply to our own lives and our own worlds, but also just the amount of heart that's in this book. That also was what immediately made this a favorite for me, was just the heart that was in it, especially how things came together at the end too.
Beautiful. Yeah.
The person that you dismiss, Tara comes on as this clownish character, but there's more to her than that.
Yeah.
Having her crowning moment in that story meant so much, because you can never dismiss the people, because if you're in a disaster, and I've seen some pretty difficult things getting solved, even starting at 17 outbound brigade, the person that you think can't solve it or isn't going to do it is often the one who comes through. And the one who goes in there with all the muscles and all the guns and all the whatevers, who thinks they know everything, is often the one who's the coward and who backs right up. So you can't write people off. It's dangerous to write people off.
Yeah, I assume that Bertera is the person you meant by the fat lady singing earlier. It was such a brilliant moment when she's a hero, she is such a hero in that moment. And I was just saying, yes, when she
And
came
Chasm
along.
never wrote her off. If you read the first scene where she comes on and everybody's kind of, he says right there, she's worth 10 berserkers and a whole ream of intelligence guys. She always knows what's going on. So don't write people off. So that was the first moment where I really was showing his clear insight, where he could see through to the heart of a character that other people might have written out.
Yep. We have a quick question from Jennifer Robin, 72. Do you plan on writing any novellas in this world? This is the only book you have in this world so far. She would love some backstory to the world. Any plans for that, Janny?
No, when I do a standalone, it's a standalone.
Yay.
I don't like bringing people on. If I said it's a standalone book, I mean that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's one and done. So I've got plenty of related novellas and short stories connected to the bigger Light and Shadows. And there's some 33 short stories or short fiction that are connected to nothing else. So out of a total of 36 printed short stories, you can find things that don't connect to anything, things that are shared universe, and things that are connected to Light and Shadows. But I don't plan to do anything in this world because I really like to keep my promise to the readers. If I said this stands alone, it does.
Fair enough.
What would I write anyway? I mean, I really plumbed the bottom of what that book was about. I think anything else would be a letdown.
Perhaps. Yeah. But another question, a quick one from Angela. How hard was it to write the fates of the horses? This was just the toughest parts for me, in spite of how much the humans suffered too. When those very faithful horses, particularly Fuzette, was the one that really broke me, I think. She was just so solid and so faithful. And when they had to put her away in order to avoid a much worse fate, it was heartbreaking. So how hard was that? Angela's question is, the deaths of the two mares toward the end was so heartbreaking. So how?
Well, I cried right in the scene. Trust me. I've had to put my older horses away when they get to the age where they have to, and it's always me making the choice. You have to understand with a large animal, you can't manage the pain or you can't manage the disability like you can with a small animal. You totally can't. And if you look at horses in the wild, they never have to get old and decrepit. They never have to suffer that long because they signal a predator pretty fast. When they're ready to go, they signal a predator, and that's the way it plays out. They're done. So you can't cling to them. People try and they nurse them along for years, and the horse is in pain all the time and completely miserable. So it's part of your responsibility of taking care of them is to know when to let go. And, we were talking about energetic templates. I've watched outside my window. I live in Florida, and there's a lot of wildlife in my neighborhood because it's a rural area. I've seen animals that were injured, and a predator would be there right away and take them out. Bam, gone. And another animal that I thought, it was a crow actually, that had Nile fever, and it was screwed up. It couldn't fly, and but its family was feeding it. And I was throwing noodles out there, and that bird survived. And there was a hawk sitting on the phone pole. That hawk could have gone down and taken out that bird, and he recovered. He recovered enough to be able to fly. He recovered enough to be able to stand up. And within a year, you couldn't tell that he had a partially paralyzed wing.
Wow.
So I really think animals do choose their moment to go. And as a responsible person, you have to listen to them. And in the case of what had happened in the course of that rundown house chasm, I would hope that a person being responsible, however much you love that animal, sometimes you have to let go because nature would have let go, and keeping them beyond the point where it makes sense and they're just suffering. So it's one of the hard things that, unfortunately, we're reasoning human beings. It never feels right. You always cry.
Yeah.
But you can sense when it's the right choice.
Wow. Well, we have a couple other questions here from David. This is for you, Janny. Were you reading any detective stories for inspiration for the first half of the book?
I didn't read any books for inspiration directly for this book at all, but I certainly drew off a lifetime of reading, and I didn't encounter science fiction and fantasy till I was well into my teens. So I read everything. I read every kind of mystery. I read Dick Francis. I read every kind of everything, historicals. I read my dad's thrillers, you know, I read John MacDonald, and I read, so the list of books that I went through, the only thing I really avoided strenuously was horror because it worked too well for me. I don't need to be scared, thank you all the same. I see enough stuff every day that if I want to get worked up. So yeah. I avoid horror, though if I have to write a horror scene, I can make it horrific, but I won't devote an entire novel to that. So yeah, I read plenty of thrillers and plenty of mysteries. So I know how they work. Neo Marsh, all the real greats. I love their work. I grew up on it.
Well, speaking of horrifying, you have another question here from Paramita Mukherjee, and that is about Mikhail's scars. The physical scars, of course, are intense, right? And what about the scars, she asks you, on his psyche? Is healing even possible considering his extreme repression? I think it's a great question, and Jennifer Robin also has an answer to that. But what do you think, Janny? Is Mikhail, is he going to be able to heal from all of that trauma?
What is healing? Do you consider healing restoring everything to exactly the way it was before the trauma happened? Do you consider healing going back to perfect health before you had to have a major surgery, or you had a major illness, or you had a major problem? What is healing? To me, healing is not going backwards and erasing what happened to you. Just erase your memory. Go get electrical shock and, you know, go get Alzheimer's. If that's healing, you forgot. To me, healing is being able to take what happened to you and rebuild and use that scar to your advantage, because you have an experience and you've survived it. There's value in that. So to me, a healing is not restoring what was prior to the event. It's taking that event and incorporating that and enabling you to vault past that event and take what happened to you and go further. That to me is healing, is being able to continue on with something that you would not have had without that situation. And I'll add, it isn't necessarily the best way to learn how to do that is to create a catastrophe in your life. There's other ways to learn that. You can learn it from someone else who went through it. You can learn it by being empathetic. You can learn it by reading a book. There's thousands of ways to learn. But sometimes when you hit that wall, it's all about what they said in the Batman movie. When we fall down, we pick ourselves back up, and it's learning how to do that. So to me, healing is creating a new form of functionality. So no, Mikhail is never going to be the person he was before all that happened, but it doesn't impair him in every way that matters. He made it work for him. He turned it into a strength.
Wow.
Wow. Beautifully said. So one more question for now from the chat, and then I'm going to turn it over to Blaise to see if he has any questions. But this question is from Esme, and the question is, where did you get the inspiration for Carries?
Watching falconers. Oh yeah, my landlord was Daniel Mannix, and he had live falconry going on in my backyard. I watched him man eagles and hawks, and right outside my window. And in fact, when he lost them and they're just as tangled in the big tall trees, guess who got to climb up on the little tiny branches in the very top of the trees? And it was like, hand me the hawk before the tree breaks and you fall down. So watching the tremendous agility of those birds, and then taking some of the ideas of a bird dragon or a griffin and turning it into the most nasty predator I could possibly imagine. So melting together something reptilian, something bird, something that breathes fire, that's an absolutely formidable danger, but it's not malicious. We treat our wildlife like it's malicious all the time, and it truly, truly isn't. Right. Half the time it's just trying to get away from you. So what are we doing as a society when people go to Yellowstone and get killed by a bison because they think they can take a selfie next to it, or, you know, take my baby up and sit it on top of an alligator? I kid you not. The park rangers here have seen it. They'll sit the kids on an alligator and take a picture. So losing the respect of the predatory aspect of those animals, and then the animal pays.
Right, right.
So I wanted to create a contrast between the real enemy that was going after these people energetically and really truly causing damage, and the predator that's just doing it to survive. It's innocent, but it's nonetheless deadly.
Yeah, very effectively done, I would say. And you embody that philosophy, I believe, in Mikhail's, his relationship with the One Horse, particularly with Stormfront, and then also with his attitude toward the Carries as well. He doesn't see them as evil. He respects them as creatures. So really well done. Blaise, how about you? And you must have some questions by now, spoiler-filled questions.
Yes. So mine's a two-parter. So just bear with me for a second. Because we were talking about scenes that just pull on your heartstrings. Mine happened actually when I just reread the finale. So, Orania, when you first hear about her through like a flashback, you see in Mikhail's company tour when he was in the South, like defending I forget the name of the city, but through a siege. And then through tragic events, she has very bad a very bad injury to her mind. And then towards the end, at the end, when the desert tribe are performing their, we'll call it a ritual, she's healed and she remembers, and it was just, it pulled on my heartstrings. I actually cried a little bit. It was just one of the more touching moments I think I've read. And I believe Orania is Juswa, how you say it? Jusod, sister. And just that interaction with Jusod and Mikhail in the first half of the book, of when you discover his royal lineage, what he's giving up for that, and just the hardships that he had to go through was just fantastic. My question is, putting all these history and these little flashbacks into a standalone, and reading Wars of Light and Shadow, you put that into 10 long books. What was the challenge with that? How are you able to compact it into such, it's only like a 650 page book. How are you able to compact that so well? Because I can't imagine this was easy.
Life experience. And this is going to touch on something I've never live chatted about anywhere, because it's things in our society that just are not talked about. And one of those things is menopause and what women can go through. And I had a really rough time with menopause. I had hot flashes every 15 minutes that were severe. They woke me up. So I was sleep deprived in slow increments over a period of several years, because in my family, on the female side, menopause could last a long time. My mother was still getting hot flashes at 70, God forbid.
Wow.
And I was under intense pressure writing. My career was falling apart at that point. I lost my US publisher. My agent in England had severe diabetes and lost a foot and never told me. And so I thought, I was right after Peril's Gate. It was after Hell's Chasm. The whole publishing industry fell apart. After 9/11, nobody bought anything. So this book that was going to restart my career in the US totally failed to sell at all. So I was in a major depression because I didn't know where I was going next. And it turned out England was ready to buy my next book, but the agent never submitted it. And I thought he had, and I thought the silence. So I went through a 2-year silence where literally I thought my career was done, combined with menopause, being waked up every 10 minutes. So what happened to me was sleep deprivation. It screwed up my brain chemistry so badly I could not fall asleep. So I would have 3 and 4 days where I'd be wide awake, could not sleep. Let me tell you, the gears of your reality slip really hard. You hallucinate, you see things other people don't. You're running on a totally different plane of perception than everyone else around you. And all I needed was sleep, but I had these damn people, when I was slipping off my cracker, so to speak, major events, which they would call a psychotic break. It wasn't, it was sleep deprivation. But they're telling me I'm bipolar. They're telling me this. They're telling me that. They want to, put me on all these drugs. And I'm going to the doctors. I've lived 55 years on this planet and never had this kind of problem. I had to work out. It was sleep deprivation. And when that got solved, everything slipped back together. and started to work. But even coming out of an event like that, where you go 4 days with no sleep and you're not perceiving, it takes you 3 or 4 days for your brain to come back together again. And you're still waking up with 3 or 4 parallel tracks of thoughts in your mind, literally 3 or 4 different things that you're thinking simultaneously, and you're hearing it all at once. You're not schizophrenic. You're just unable to reintegrate, because that's what sleep does for you.
Yep.
So I came out of that experience with just a tremendous sorrow for the people who are mentally adjusted differently. And we don't have any way. Only recently have they discovered drugs to fix these people and get them calm enough to handle. That's not a solution, and that's not healing them. And coming out of an episode like that, there was, the first 48 hours, I'd say, if I can do nothing else for the rest of my life but cook my husband's food and do his laundry, that is a life and I can be useful. I couldn't read a sentence because I couldn't remember the end of the sentence from the beginning until everything came back together. So having gone to that extreme and come back,
wow,
having wrestled with a medical profession that knows nothing, and thank goodness I fell back on my own resources. I had more to draw on than what they were telling me, because what they were telling me wasn't right. So I kept after it. So here I am today. No problem. I know if I don't sleep for 2 days, go to, make sure that I do. Find a way to get over this. So we don't talk about menopause. We don't talk about, you will, if you look up on Google, you'll see menopausal psychosis. You'll see pregnancy psychosis. Hormones can really mess you up. So Arania's situation of her hopelessness, her being caught and him being on the other side of it and unable to help, I was sort of using that dynamic. And I did not have to go through this for terribly long. I solved that whole sequence in a year or two. So the combination of depression and thinking my career was gone, and menopause, and all this losing sleep, and then losing the calibration of where your mind can focus on what everybody else sees as real, was a profound experience. So yeah, I drew on that. And I hope that experience will help other people, because it's something that we don't talk about.
Absolutely.
So many women, writers, I see them hit menopause, they hit despair, because the way that they composed their novels before that changed into a different system. And there was a transition period of maybe 3 to 5 years where they thought they'd never write another word, and they're completely losing it to despair. And I'm saying, be patient. It'll come back together. But that hormone shift is absolutely huge. It's going to change how you think, it's going to change how your brain works. And you're going to have to refine your footing. How many women would not be in despair if they knew this? But it's something that everyone teases them about. Oh, you're menopausal. It's a horrible thing to go into that blind and not know what can happen and not have any support. So I'm happy that I had the resilience to see myself through, or I could have ended up on antipsychotic drugs for the rest of my life, and I don't need them.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you for sharing that. And you might have just answered PL's question, but PL asks in the chat, what makes you most proud about writing to ride Hell's Chasm?
Everything, because every book that I'm working on is the culmination of what I've experienced to that date. And some of it's made up, sure, but like the mountaineering and Master of White Storm, I've never done it in the winter, but I've done mountaineering in the summer. And so I read 4 or 5 alpine journals where they summarize all of the alpine climbs for the last 5 years. That went into the alpine climbing series in Master of White Storm, and then I cross-checked it with people who'd actually done that to be sure I got the details right. So I try to bring that experience to the armchair, because you never know where your books are going to go. One little girl said she saved herself because she read Nancy Drew, and she was kidnapped and thrown in the trunk of a car, and she was resilient enough because of Nancy Drew to dig out the car's toolkit. She took the screwdriver and disassembled the light and stuck her hand out of the rear tail light and waved her hand, and they flagged the car. So just that attitude of you're not without resource, even if you're caught like Arania was, or even if you're caught in some impossible situation that you don't think, there may be a way out, but you're not going to see it if you don't dig it up. or there may be a person that you want to write off, but if you don't, you're going to learn something from them. So that's probably what I'm proudest of is that ability to imagine that there's something there. You just have to open your eyes and see it.
Yeah.
I appreciate you sharing your story so much, Janny. And you're right that menopause.
Gary, I don't talk about this because, you know, fantasy writers are half crazy anyway. You know, a lot of the things that I talked about that I had contact with other cultures. So I didn't write off that there were other ways to approach this. It saw me through. All those people taught me things.
That's beautiful.
That's beautiful. Yeah.
And if it helps one woman or helps somebody else help their sister, because our society totally writes this stuff off and it's wrong, it makes it unnecessarily hard.
I know that a lot of people are going to watch this and it will be very helpful.
Absolutely. And I just want to speak to that point on the character of Anya, because she goes through hell in Hell's Chasm, makes some very difficult choices. I mean, she has to, and it's hard on her, and she doesn't always act super gracefully, and you know, who would? At the same time, I think somebody in the chat was talking about the sacrifice that she makes at the end. I did have some questions about that, but before getting into that, I just want to say that, like, I think one thing that I really appreciated was how when the seer was talking to her and talking about her future with some other prince, or with some prince instead of with Mikhail, that he said that she would be someone worthy to be with, that nobody could deny her worthiness or value after what she had been through. And it's clear that whole situation, it weathered her. It weathered her. It was hard. It's not like she got out of that being this, this pristine, youthful princess bride. She came out of it a stronger, but more weathered, wiser person. And I really loved how the seer said that, because, like I said, it's clear that she doesn't lose value because of that. In fact, it adds value in some ways. And I think that that's just a message I want to see as a woman in books, personally.
I think it's true of any teen. They're untested. They're untried. And to see what's going to happen to her from Mikhail's perspective, and him knowing all the ways it can go wrong, and knowing what it's going to cost her to survive, and having him know what he has to put her through so she will survive. Of course, she's going to be different coming out the other side. But I wanted to show two things there. One was that she had gained the wisdom to see the bigger picture and make the right choice for her people, for healing the whole situation. She needed to do what she did. And the second thing was that from Mikhail's perspective, he would have had way too much experience to be put back in that little fishbowl.
Yeah.
Now, it was pointed out to me by Paul, and he made a very wonderful point. Wouldn't it have been great if this character had gone back and Cecily had to have a person of color as their king? And he had a point. That never occurred to me as something that would have been a desired ending from a different perspective than mine. I just saw his long experience, that he would have probably been happier paired with someone who understood. It's like the guys who went across to World War II and they married someone who had lived in Europe, and the American women were complaining, and the men were saying, we can't come back and have that closer relationship to you because you don't know what we went through. You can't see the bigger picture for us. So we had to be with someone that had seen that devastation, that had been through that horror show and had to rebuild it. And so that's what I was thinking with the ending. But everybody who reads a book brings their own suitcase of experience to it, their own hopes, their own dreams, their own values, what they think is important. And I'm not going to get it right for everybody. But I always enjoy having an intelligent discussion with someone like Paul, the way he pointed out that this was a different aspect, because I learned something that I wouldn't have thought of from my perspective as a white privileged person. I wouldn't have quite seen it that way. So I was grateful to that, because who knows where that's going to pop in another story somewhere else. Just listening to each other.
I had a question about that, and related to this question up here too. So one thing I really I just really was fascinated just trying to understand Michael and where he was coming from and his more nuanced way of being. So earlier on in the book, he tells Anya, he says, "My strength, my choice, my will arise in answer to His Majesty's command. Here is the paradox. I am not his to possess. My power to act in his name is not his. I know this, he may not, or he might forget it at his peril." So I found that really powerful about him, that he is loyal to the king, and at the same time, he's not the king's to possess. There's a distinction there, and I thought that was such a powerful, nuanced. I think discernment is the word that comes to mind. There's a lot of discernment there with Michael, and I think that one thing that I was wondering about too is at the end, it was ultimately Anya's choice to free him. And I thought that also kind of created a little bit of a paradox because he was not possessed by anybody. That was the paradox of who he was or how he stated it. But at the end, it seemed like he was kind of bound to her. And so I guess I just had a question about that, like how that worked. And when the seer was kind of predicting things not working out, if she had chosen Mikhail to come back with her, I guess I was a little confused. Like, was it just a matter of that he wouldn't want to go back to that fishbowl? He could never be happy in that fishbowl? Or was it a matter of the people there? Well, we already get the idea that people would never accept him because they have that fishbowl mentality. But I read that to my husband because I was kind of exploring that. And he got the impression from that passage that the subtext there was that the people would have killed him because they would have never accepted him. So it just came up with a couple. So I guess I have a couple of questions there. One, even though Mikhail is not anyone's to possess, how it was Anya's decision at the end. But two, also, if she had chosen him, was the idea that he would have gotten killed incessantly.
Not gotten killed. He might have died. He might have died because bravo, first of all, to you for picking out that passage, because to me, that is the paradox of the soldier. Do you follow the orders or not? And if you go against your officers, you risk everything. You can be shot for insubordination. And yet, when it comes time for the criminal court at The Hague, you are ultimately responsible for making the ethical choice in that moment. And you have the power of death in your hands. And when Anya tells him that she loves him, he says, "I'm a weapon and I'm too well suited for war." He tells her straight out, he knows what he is. He knows what his strength is. And so I saw him going back to that fishbowl as it would take away what his true purpose was, what he was best at in his life. So it wasn't just a case of seeing him rule the kingdom. He probably would have done a really good job. But did he want that job? Was he heart and soul suited for that job? So
I love that because it also kind of speaks to him not being exploited. Because in a way he was kind of being exploited as a weapon. I mean, Toscan even said that he's a weapon to us.
But he wasn't an inert weapon. He chose to be there. He made a difference. The kingdom wouldn't have survived without him being exactly who he was and exactly the experience that he had. So I see that as a formative moment for him when he said, "I didn't know who my family were. I didn't have my culture behind me. So I put myself to the ultimate test, which was the martial arts training that he survived." And so that changed him. And so I think very clearly the way I perceive the character, if you project past the end of the book, the projection past the end of the book is he goes back and he reclaims the kingdom that was taken by the other princess, backed by all the allies he's won. And if I was to project forward, I would have figured that Anya would have sent Taskin to help. Jusaud would have been there. All those people he pulled together and got talking to each other to save the one kingdom would have saved the second. And would that have been the best thing for Anya and Cecily? Would she have thrown her kingdom into that mix again? But letting him go back so if I project his character past Hell's Chasm, which is why I won't read the sequel, it's implied what happens at the end. It's told that he goes back and saves that kingdom, taking what he knew, bringing the East and the West together to solve that problem. So where is he going to be most effective, and how is that important to him? Because this was his biggest failure. He could now have victory over his biggest defeat. So everybody's going to reassemble those pieces differently, because everybody brings their suitcase of values to the table. And that's one of the things that you do when you write, is you put it all together in the best way you see fit, but there's always going to be that edge that somebody else wishes had gone different.
I love his autonomy, though. I really love his sense of autonomy, because I think that's what they want. That's what the guardsmen want, and even Toscan to some degree. Even though I think he ultimately he figures his path out. He figures things out. But I think that ultimately it would be easier to try to control Mikhail, which they can't control him. They can't. They try to pin him down and they can't. And he's always a step ahead of everyone. He kind of makes the guardsmen look a little incompetent, in my opinion, at times.
Well, he's way more experienced than them. They're garrison guys in a little tiny country that never had a war.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, if you reread the book, you will see very clearly what he's not telling them is too dangerous for them to know. The minute he tells anybody what's going on, they become a target. And so until he's figured out exactly who's doing what, he has no choice but to keep it under the hat, and they can't see that perspective. So it isn't just a case of, oh, they didn't talk to each other.
Right.
It's hedging his bets, because he's seen people die horribly. And the first two people that had the indicator that there was a sorcerer loose in this kingdom are dead. So he is trying to protect the pieces until he can figure out where the threat is coming from. And they don't understand that. It's so far outside of their bailiwick, they can't see it.
Yeah.
How about you, Blaise? Do you have another point or a question you'd like to talk about?
Yes, and this is one that we see pretty early in the book. It has to do with Mikhail's his untrained magic of when he's around, like when they're looking for Anya, and they find a picture of her or a piece of clothing, and just being around that and touching it, he sees visions. I don't know if it's a vision or a dream, one or the other, of what Anya is up to, where she is, and you put those pieces together, he's able to eventually locate her. I guess my question is, what was the inspiration for those particular like semi flashback scenes? Because I think the most you've gone into them, like those like scenes of where like Anya is, it doesn't last more than a page, and it comes back to Mikhail or his point of view, and also they're at the beginning of several chapters. You get like little hints into what the surrounding environment, the characters or different kingdoms are up to. So just wanted to know what was the inspiration for that, and was this something that was easy or difficult to write?
So these are the witch thoughts, in other words.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, certainly we have evidence that sometimes people see things that other people don't. We have precognition. There are cultures that have precognition, and it's part of an everyday event. It's part of their everyday life. You know, you talk to somebody in Australia from a Aboriginal culture, and they'll tell you the dream time is still happening. Past and present don't exist. There's only the present, and everything else is happening like a movie on the same page. Other cultures don't perceive things the same way we do. If you read The Primal Mind, it explains how certain cultures have trouble with colonial white people's addiction to clocks, because they know time is elastic. You know time is elastic. When you're doing something that you love, time stops.
Yeah.
And then you look up and you go, where did all that time go? Or you're sitting waiting for something to happen, and an hour can stretch to be a year. It's perception of time that really matters. Time is not something that we have to measure it mechanically. But what's a machine? When you break it all down, it's energy, right? Every atom that creates everything, there's more space in it. There's more energy. There's all these electrical charges. What is our universe really made of? And time, relativity, all that stuff, we can prove mathematically what's going on, but we can't wrap our minds around it because we're a biological creature. So if you do talk to other cultures, or you read books about how they think, it's totally not the way we're brought up. They don't mix time. They don't look at it the same way. It's simultaneity. And so they can see, some of those cultures can see other things around the edges that we're taught very early not to see. You know, that moment of having deja vu when you see yourself walking through the woods and you're looking at yourself walking over there out of body when you're a little kid. Doesn't happen when you get older, but it happened all the time when you were little. Or a moment would just stop and everything would dissolve because your focus was so tight on something. We forget that. But other angles of view, human beings have other angles of view where it's different. And you see things that are different. This was an experience I had when I was in Australia, and this nobody told me. It just happened. I went 2.5 hours into Aboriginal territory with a friend of mine, got the permit and had the camping gear, took us, and we went to see a gallery that was in the middle of nowhere. The roads were all dirt. This gallery was a bunch of people who had a generator. They had a Wi-Fi connect, you know, they had internet somehow, and they were selling Aboriginal art to the rest of the world. That gallery still exists, but there was no connection to they were in the middle of Aboriginal territory. And this cinder block building had no windows, no glass. It was just holes. And in there were all these paintings done by Native artists. And you could go in there and buy a painting done, and you could talk to the artists, and dogs walked through, kids walked through, anybody walked through. The dust blew in, and there was a little old woman, and she had a brush in her hand and down on her hands and knees, and she's dusting all the red dust off the paintings one by one and putting them in a stack. And I'm sitting here watching this go on, and suddenly there's this painting, and I'm not kidding. There was a hole about 6 inches across, and it was black, and it kind of had a fuzzy blue edge. It's like getting a ocular migraine where suddenly a piece of your vision drops out, but
Yep.
This was no migraine, okay? And if you looked away from that painting and you looked back, it moved. And then she would dust off another bunch, and there was another one that had a hole in it, and it was done by the same artist.
Wow.
And I'm like freaking out. I'm saying, this thing looks like a hole in the universe. You could put your arm into the shoulder, and yet this is impossible. So I'm watching this, and I'm like going, I can't believe what my eyes are telling me, even though I've done alternative things and I've seen alternative stuff happen that was unexplainable. And this little old man came up and sort of looks at me and grins. And he keeps looking at me and grinning. And each time she would pile paintings on top of the paintings with the holes in them, he would pull them off so that they were exposed again. And there's the blasted hole. I'm like, he knows I can see it. I know he can see it. He's playing games with me. And I didn't say a word. When I came back to the States and I talked to a person from our country who's from another culture than white colonial, he said, you didn't get it. He knew you could see it. He was waiting for you to ask about it, but you didn't ask him. So he's not going to volunteer telling you anything, but he knew what you were doing. He was inviting you to share what he knew about what you were looking at. So it's like, there are thousands of unexplained things. Why not a witch thought? Why not something that where time is simultaneity, where physics has already proven that's true?
Neat. Wow.
Yeah.
I have a great question in the chat here from Paramita. And it is, how much of a patriarchy is Cecily at the time when the book begins? If there were no economic strategic advantages, could, and this is probably Anya, have succeeded as queen without any matrimonial alliance? So,
That's a good question.
Great questions.
She certainly could have, except she needed a cultural angle that her culture did not possess. And she knew that. So could she have ruled that kingdom without this bigger threat on her own? Sure. Sure. I don't know how to say this, but I'm going to say it because I've done a lot of reenactment, and I've gone on squaring vessels. I've sailed offshore. I've done all kinds of things where I was the only woman in a crew of men crewing a boat or whatever, wilderness. I don't care what it is. The sexes are different, and this is good. And there's some women who are really, really strong. I'm really, really strong. I can probably pick up any man and move him over to get him out of my way. But
I believe that.
doing primitive living, and you're on a sailboat where every line has to be sweated, and you don't have a mechanical advantage of a winch, there's a limit to how much upper body strength I have. There's a limit to how far I can carry a load. There are advantages to the fact my center of gravity is lower on my body. I can stay on a horse better than a man sometimes because of the physical makeup of where the center of gravity of a woman's body is if you're built average. So I don't like saying, is this patriarchy? When sometimes the division of labor in a more primitive culture that had less mechanical advantage, it made sense for women to do certain jobs because physically they were more capable of that. And sometimes you need that upper body strength. If I'm going to muscle a bull around a pasture, frankly, all the same, I'd rather have a bigger man than I am do it because it's a handful. So what is wrong with using the advantages that you have to the best of your ability? And that's not to say that there aren't some women built strong enough to do the strongest jobs. I've seen them. I met one of the first women merchant marine captains, and she was nobody I'd want to get in a fight with in a back alley. She was strong as an ox. So there is an average that says most women don't have the upper body strength or the hormonal advantage that a man has to carry heavy muscle. So why make a big deal of that? Now that we have mechanical advantage, can a woman be as equally effective on a battlefield as a man? Yeah, she can, because that mechanical advantage changes the equation. But if you take that out of the picture, you're going to have working to your strengths. And sometimes there's just facts of life. A little person, I'm 5'6", and rigging wet back in the days when I crewed sailboats, I weighed 115 pounds. I could do a lot, but there were things that I couldn't do because I can't equal that guy who weighs 185 and lift weights. Okay. But I learned how to use my weight to compensate. So could Anja have run that kingdom? She absolutely could. If she had the cultural background and the people to advise her that knew how to handle the problem that landed on their plate, could she have managed it if she had viziers to help her in her kingdom? Certainly. She didn't need a husband to do that. She needed the alliance because she didn't have that, and she was smart enough to know. So that answer may not satisfy some people out there, but as somebody who's worked in all kinds of circumstances and backgrounds, equal playing field means you choose the person who's best suited for the job in that moment. And that's reality. And the more you can put your baggage aside and face that, then the more likely you're going to succeed, because you'll be able to pick the person for the job, person, woman or man, that's best suited to get it done. So the tasking matters and what your attributes are matter.
Yeah, 100% can get behind that. Yeah, absolutely. I love, by the way, just to insert this here, how towards the end, Anya is thinking internally about, I guess, how Taskin, he counseled her. And it says here that his sage counsel on unjust punishment that might befall her arrogance as a royal. And she wasn't going to use her tears also at a certain point to a woman, the advantage of her tears to kind of manipulate Mikkel into stopping when he wants to keep going. So I just liked those little parts of her story too. I love that when you can kind of build in sort of parts of a character in just a simple sentence or passing thought that the character has. So it's like, okay, I get the idea that Taskin was very instrumental in her upbringing, and she learned a lot of wisdom about how not to abuse her power as a royal.
We've all seen people manipulate. We've seen women who know how to manipulate men and do it. And I've seen sailboat crews where they needed one more person to make the insurance policy work. So they took a bar bunny on a sailboat, and we're going out of the harbor, and we've got maybe 3-foot waves and a 20-knot breeze. Perfect sailing weather. Okay. Perfect sailing weather. And this bar bunny is panicking. She is losing it. She is scared to death. And I just grabbed her by the collar and said, look, do you see the captain? Is he scared? Do you see me? Am I scared? Till you see us scared, you don't worry about it. But halfway through that trip, we had very, very, very light wind. And so we had to run a spinnaker 24/7. That's hard work because you drift off your course by a couple of degrees. That spinnaker is going to wrap and turn into an hourglass, and a couple $1,000s worth of sail is going to shred. And you're going to be half the night untangling this mess. And you don't want to be untangling this mess when a squall hits and you got to deal with something else because you got to get it the heck down, right? She burst into tears.
Oh,
Captain of the boat spent his whole time consoling her. He was going to protect her first. If we'd gone down, I guarantee you he would have saved her first. And I was the one who knew how to run the sails, run the radio, So I've watched women use their tears to manipulate men. Don't think it doesn't happen. And I've watched men lord it over women and cow them. And you got to get back in their face real quick or they'll keep doing it. So I wanted to show that process of, yeah, she could have done this. She could have used that manipulative, but she chose not to because she was taught better. We can always be better. We can always learn to be better. We can always break out of our stereotypes and learn to be better. But that doesn't mean that that evil stereotype isn't attached to our knowledge. It's right there.
Yeah. Wow. That story belongs in a book, Janny.
Yeah.
I have a feeling that if Anya hadn't been capable of ruling the kingdom before she went through Hell's Chasm, she sure as hell was capable after going through Hell's Chasm. And that what a way. I mean, I have to ask one little question myself: is how did you think of that scene where Mikhail puts her in the carcass of one of her beloved horses, and of course, it wasn't something she was going to want to go along with, and then suspends himself beneath as the carry takes off with them. I mean, that is just one of the most brilliant devices I've ever seen in a book. How did you come up with that?
That was the scene. I didn't know how I was going to fix it. And I said, okay, they're going to come to this insoluble crevice. And the night before, he says he doesn't know how he's going to fix it. He doesn't know how he's going to solve it. Innovation and imagination. We would not have wars if we used our imagination soon enough to come up with an alternative solution. So the obvious one was, yeah, he would take a carry wing and make a hang glider. And I said, nope, not going to happen that way. So it was an organic thing where literally the night before I had to write the scene, there it was. And I think that's the power of human problem solving. People don't understand how inspiration truly works. Inspiration works because you leap the gap. You start on one side of the problem and you see where you want to be. And there's this chasm in between that you don't know how you're going to get there. But if you stay focused on where you want to be, where you want to end up, trust me, your subconscious is going to keep on working on it. And it will reassemble your reality. It will reassemble what's available at hand in your current picture. And it will create you a solution if you get out of the way and let it. So it's much like writing a book. You start it, you don't know how it's going to end, or you know how you want it to end. And the journey to get there is unpredictable because it's your human ability to use imagination to solve a problem that takes you there. But if you understand, intuition is not about knowing it in advance, and you don't tackle it with logic. You tackle it with trust that you're focused on the end game. Your brain is going to do its thing. It's going to get you there. So that's how that scene reassembled. It took what was right there. And this is how life works. You don't know how you're going to solve that health problem, or you don't know how you're going to solve that financial problem or that job impasse. But if you focus on where you want to go and allow your mind to work on it, your imagination is this most underutilized human tool that we have.
Yeah. Wow. So in other words, the way you came up with that scene is a metaphor for the book's theme, isn't it?
Totally.
Yeah. That is brilliant. That is amazing. I loved all of that.
Always another solution. Just we close our minds down to it and we say it's not possible. And then we get in a war because we go back to the old way every time. Instead of trying to do something new and different, we keep going back to the old way. And it's a pity because we keep cutting the same groove in the record when we're equipped to do something so much more.
Yeah.
Wow.
And it's amazing because they are tested. I mean, both Anya and I would say Mikhail as well. As hard as it, I mean, I feel like he was tested in a way in having to rely on her at the very end too.
Yep.
And I think other characters in the book also get tested too with this sort of same theme in a way. I know there's a scene where Jusod, if I'm saying his name right, where he has to pull out the sword and he has to attack and he has to kind of bypass his whole oath to not do harm as a medical professional. And again, it's that idea of like he dared not pause to mourn his broken integrity. He can't stop to think about it. And it's the same thing, even just the whole journey, by the way. So as innovative as that was, also the whole entire journey of transporting Chasm across the castle was just genius and crazy and amazing stuff.
Yeah, and then the old grandmother goes, "We've been waiting for you for 2 hours."
Yes.
Stop it like a woman would have.
Yeah, absolutely. Blaise,
I hope there's some humorous moments in there. It's not all grim.
No, it was funny.
Oh, there's some great humor in Bertrand and several of the great characters, which is much needed in a story with as much pain as there is in here and trauma. But Blaise, we'll have time, I think, for a couple more questions. You got anything that you want to ask at this point?
Yep, just one more from me. One of the better side characters in this book is Jusod. We're first introduced to him. He's a healer who Taskins calls to help Mikhail with his injured leg and his scars. And then we're learning more and more about his backstory, how he's from royal heritage, and and his backstory and how he ended up getting to Cecily for that. And then we get more background into Jusod's royal family, and how that's interacted with Mikhail. Was he, I guess, when you were first writing this story, was supposed to be just like a small side character with like a bigger historical background, or did he was he one person you ended up wanting to have a bigger role than what he had? Because I felt like he had a lot more in his backstory that could have gotten into. I just wanted to question about that.
He is somewhat of a paradox of something I've observed culturally that really, among the many things that ossified culture ticks me off, and that is that the makeup of people doesn't necessarily follow what your gender is. I have met men who are incredibly good with children. They would be happy doing childcare for the rest of their lives, but they're ridiculed, they're cut down, they're treated like they don't matter. So the paradox of Jusod was coming from such a very masculine warrior, horse culture, but he's a masseuse or a massage guy. He's a healer. He does body work. So the idea that there is no stigma attached to that he can do what he's suited for, he can do what he loves, that he's seeking knowledge. His culture sends the multiple children from the royal house out to learn something and bring back the knowledge. So the fact that it's not genderized, I think it's a big mistake to genderize roles, because everybody is a different makeup. Some women are very masculine, some men are very feminine, and it shouldn't be stigmatized. They should be able to do what they're suited for. I'm letting my husband get that. They should do what they're suited for, and there shouldn't be any shame involved with that.
Absolutely. Beautifully said.
So Jusod sort of embodies that in the book. Is my fury when I meet these people who are so well suited to something, but they aren't following what their heart tells them to do because somebody else's gender role got in the way, either women or men, doesn't matter. And so that idea of we got to be prejudiced, we got to tell people what their life is before they figured out who they are. That's wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a couple more questions in the chat, and I'll let Johanna ask the last question. So we'll get to, we're putting pressure on you, Johanna. But Paramita wants to know, one theme in this book for me was conditional versus unconditional trust. This is a great point, I think. The former, how most Thessalians treated Mikhail. The latter epitomized in the horse's relationship with Anya. And she asks, what do you think about that?
Traditional, unconditional trust. Yep. Horses are not born with this. They don't trust people out they trust the other horses. They trust the herd to tell them what to do. And if you separate them from the herd, they get really paranoid. They have to think for themselves. Same with dogs. You take dogs out of the pack and they have to think for themselves. So what you have to cultivate with them is a relationship where you interact with them to the point where you break their conditioning. You're asking them to do things a horse would not normally naturally do, threaten his footing, or a dog. And so you build a trust where you have a trust with that horse, where you say, you don't like that footing right there, but I'm telling you it's safe, so step in it anyway. It'll be all right. And they learn to look on you like they would another horse. If you say it's okay, I'll do it. And woe betide you if you ask them to step there and they put their foot in a trap. So you earn this. You earn this. And that's where Cecily fell short with Mikhail. He proved to them over and over how trustworthy he was. He cleaned out the stews. He got the entire lower city running on a better platform than it was when he inherited. He got rid of the corruption. He got rid of, and they still didn't trust him because culturally they couldn't see past their own noses. And how many times do we do this in everyday life? You know, do you take directions from a homeless guy, or do you assume that he doesn't know anything? It's one of the things Search and Rescue has taught me. When you go through a homeless camp, these are not stupid people. A lot of them have huge education. They landed in this circumstance for whatever reason, whether it was because they hit hard times or had a mental health problem, whatever. But they're human beings, and they have the ability to discern, and they have the ability to talk to you. And if you treat them like a human and say, do you mind if I walk past your camp? Is it going to, you know, we're on a search. We're looking for somebody. We got to pass through here. Do you mind if I violate your space, even though it isn't their space? They're behind in the woods behind a Walmart. You treat them like a human being. They'll start telling you if they saw the person. They'll let you know the lay of the land. They'll let you know where you could cross that creek over there, where you might find where that person went. So it's that whole thing. You have to give them the trust that they know what they're doing. And if they don't, it's going to be evident that they're not able to help you. Yeah. So the same thing, we hit this cultural wall all the time because of our prejudices. And we look at somebody's appearance and we don't go for who's inside that appearance. I've seen bikers that look like they would murder you, be the kindest people on the whole block, and have more manners and more consideration than somebody that's well-dressed coming out of a business building, frankly. So you sort of got to drop your perceptions. And it's a challenge. The older you get, the harder it gets to do that.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Well, one more question from the chat. It's going to be from PL, who is asking, who was the most difficult character for you to write in Hell's Chasm, and why?
That's a hard question. Probably the ones that totally take no responsibility at all. Kalen was difficult because he's completely disconnected from his responsibility. He's running on privilege. He's busy whining about the things that he sees he doesn't have. And so that kind of character is hard, not because they don't exist, but because the way I've lived my life, that's a hard mindset to wrap my mind around.
Yeah. Although, to be fair to Kalen, he has been eaten by a demon. So
yes, he has. Yes, he has. So I didn't have a tough time with really any character in Hell's Chasm. That's not true of some of the other books. I have to work to get into that mindset because it is so alien to my own. You know, the ones that glorify this and justify that. That's really hard to write because I've had my elbow banged too many times on the funny bone where I was asleep and somebody woke me up. So you try to learn from that.
Right. Maybe the senior official in Cecily, who the old fellow, I forget his title, but he was always speaking against Mikhail and going all with the assumptions of the prejudice.
It was the seneschal. It was the seneschal.
Yes, the seneschal. Yes.
We've all met those people, the politician.
Yeah. Oh,
We've all met them, and you know, you want to brain them, but they exist, and you can watch how they. I mean, you know, turn on your TV any night and watch these guys that are all mouths and no do. So he wasn't hard to write because they're a dime a dozen.
That's frustrating. My goodness.
Yeah. All right. Well, I said, Johanna, that you would have the opportunity to finish us out with the final question for Janny. So
Well,
what would you like to ask?
I guess I don't know if I have an exact question. I just know, kind of piggybacking off the last two answers that you gave, it's interesting to me, just this whole journey through Hell's Chasm, how and about looks and everything is not what you our assumptions of people based on their looks or their social status, because the Prince of Deval, obviously he's possessed just as Kaelin is, but he's supposed to be this handsome, amazing prince, and we learn that he's pretty much the scum of the earth, possessed. And there was obviously some bargaining, I'm assuming, with the sorcery. I guess that could be a question, in order that led him into that situation in the first place. But also just how Mikhail and Anya going through Hell's Chasm, just all of the horrific things. I mean, she obviously doesn't get to wear any royal attire whatsoever. She looks like kind of like a poor waif in how she's dressed. They're kind of eating scraps, and the horrors of what has to happen to the poor horses. And they have to put that stink on themselves too.
Oh,
And I'm just thinking, this princess kind of having to just go after one next horrific step, one step at a time. And I really loved, there was a passage in which Mikhail tells her that we only have the next step in front of us. And he's having to, the dynamic between them was so powerful, because he had to have her trust. He knew that her psyche was very delicate, but he needed her to be strong to work through this journey. And it was such a balance. He had to practice patience at the same time as he knew the harder things that they had to do at times. And then, of course, kiss her and knock her unconscious to get them out. But I just think it's just a very powerful thing to think about throughout this book. It's just how people aren't what they seem on the outside. And sometimes these things that would seem undignified for royals to go through is what really creates true, I guess, resilience, and just some of those more profound qualities in human nature that we all strive for. So there's just a lot there to unpack that I absolutely love from what you shared in those last two answers. I don't know if it's much of a question, just an appreciation of that.
The character of the Prince of Deval, he's a snob.
Mm-hmm.
And he's using his position to kind of push everybody around. And he comes in there and he acts like he can give royal commands. And he gets corrected by Taskin one way and by Mikhail another. He gets put in his place and he doesn't like it much. So if you swapped roles there and you put Anya in his position and you put him going through Hell's Chasm, imagine the disaster you would get, because he did not have the internal character to do what she did. So the character matters. It's how you respond to the mistake. It's how you respond to the bad situation. You might not succeed, but how do you respond to the failure? That is character.
Yes.
The way you pick yourself up. And as far as Mikhail telling her focus in the moment, my father gave me one very valuable piece of advice. And he said, you have to climb a mountain one step at a time. If you look at the height of the mountain, you will overwhelm yourself, because you can't do that in one step. And people defeat themselves because they think they can do the entire journey in one step. No journey is one step. You take the step that's in front of you. So you solve the little problems one at a time, and then you look and you're at the top of the mountain. So
Wow.
Take it in step. But we're taught every TV show resolves in an hour. The big war gets done in 3 episodes when it might take years. We lose the fact that patience and the ability to take things one step at a time, the further removed we get from a subsistence living, the more we forget that. The modern conveniences make us throw that out. And people get discouraged. They get wiped out because they're taught they can solve it all in a Sesame Street 3 minutes. The teachers who taught when Sesame Street came online said the kids suddenly had a 3-minute attention span, and then it was gone. They could no longer teach an hour class anymore. The kids lost the ability to focus beyond 3 minutes, and Sesame Street created that. So in a way, having Mikhail give her that advice is a throwback to an earlier time when the modern conveniences didn't allow you to do it effortlessly. You had to build it one piece at a time. And if you do that, you'll get there.
Wow. Well, no journey is one step. I think that is a wonderful piece of wisdom for us to finish this discussion on. We have a lot of people thanking us in the chat. I also want to acknowledge Blaise was actually the one, I think, who came up with this idea to get together. So thank you, Blaise. It's just, again, I want to recommend his fantastic interview with Janny Wurts on the Wars of Light and Shadow. Really gives a great sense of the magnificence of that series, which I am so looking forward to reading and discussing. And I hope, Janny, that you will join me and AP and Jimmy when we get to that, hopefully this summer. So
I will be beyond thrilled because there is so much more in the Light and Shadows than in Hell's Chasm. It is eons deeper, wider, and bigger.
wow.
And that's been one of the things that's been overlooked about this series. It's one of the most undiscovered facets, and having AP come in and you guys come in on it, and Blaise has already read it. He has a clue what's in there.
Yeah.
I honestly was wondering if it was going to get discovered in my lifetime, you know, the full scope of what was put in there. So seeing this happen at this time, right as I'm completing the polish on the finished draft of the finale, knowing that the ending has been stuck, it is solid.
Wow.
I'm beyond thrilled this is happening. So I owe you all. It is a privilege to see this happen because my big fear was it would be discovered after I was dead.
Oh my goodness.
Have that because that's truly been a lifetime labor of love. And this little standalone has been completely overlooked. Seeing it get some attention now, it really makes me extremely happy. So, and having all of your minds working on it, it's going to show me perspectives that are in there that I didn't even know were there. So it's an honor to interact with you. Thank you.
Well, it is we who owe you thanks for these wonderful stories. Thank you so much, Janny. Thank you, Blaise. And thank you, Johanna. This has been a wonderful 2 hours. I'm sure everyone in the chat will agree. And so thank you, chat. It has been great having your insights and comments in there as well. That was really fantastic. I'm really delighted with the reception that we've had for this discussion. So once again, thank you, Janny. And
thank you so much.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. I owe it all to you guys. Wouldn't be possible without you. What you do for the book community is entirely incredible. So I really enjoy what you're doing for the book community. I watch your shows when I can. It's hard because I'm working words and listening to words, but you're really doing a service. And if they're not giving you gold medals for it, they should be.
Well, it is definitely a passion project for us. We love it, and we love great stories, which is why it's such a privilege to talk to you and hear your insights. And I'm sure that your many readers and future readers are going to appreciate this very much. And so with that, everyone, we'll say goodbye. Thanks again for coming, and
take care, everyone.
Till next time.
Thank you.